Welcome to Personal Nirvana, a podcast about mental health, psychedelics, and this modern world. Your hosts, Dr. Marcel Green and John Biggs, will explore the latest in psychiatry, medicine, and healing from a no-nonsense point of view. Dr. Green specializes in interventional psychiatry and has degrees from Columbia University and the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, while John Biggs is a reporter and author with a focus on technology. Together, they hope to tear down the walls between you and your personal nirvana.
Welcome back to Personal Nirvana, podcast about surviving and psychedelics. I'm John Biggs.
I am Dr. Marcel Green.
And we are the dynamic duo talking about stuff that's helped us over the years, I think, is probably the answer why we're doing this. You've helped hundreds of people, thousands potentially. I've essentially helped myself. So today we're going to talk about some of our favorite little plants, the psychedelic mushroom. You're familiar with these guys?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So what I wanted to do, I'm going to walk through just a history of them, talk a little bit about the different types, where you can get them, all that other good stuff. You can grow them yourself. I grow these things in my basement. I'm not going to tell you where I live. And Marcel, if you need it, let me know. But they're super easy to grow. I call it like dirt yogurt because you're basically dealing with these little mycelium that expand into like a big white bulb of mushroom spore material, and they grow super fast and it's super fun to do. All right. So psychedelic mushrooms, they're also known as psilocybin mushrooms, and they've been used for thousands of years. There's some belief that the Aztecs used them. They called them the flesh of the gods. So you would basically take these mushrooms, pull them out of the jungle, eat them, and fresh, they're even more potent. So you wouldn't even dry these things. You would just eat them fresh. Spanish missionaries recorded their use in rituals dating back to the 1500s, but eventually colonization and obviously religion led to their suppression. So around 1950, during the post-war years were a heady time for psychedelics, primarily because they were using quite a few drugs, methamphetamine, and also psychedelics during World War II. The Germans mostly to keep marching, and also they were trying to use LSD to essentially use it as a truth serum, which they figured would be a fun way to get soldiers to talk about where, like, I don't know, troop positions were. Didn't really work, but I guess everybody had fun trying. So 1950, amateur mycologist Gordon Wasson encountered their use in Mexico. He published his a story in Life magazine about psilocybin mushrooms. First time that probably the average American in the 1950s had heard about these things. These early articles, which kind of brought the psychedelics to the fore, were read by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass. And by the 1960s, these things were criminalized. People were growing them, making them. As I said, it was super easy to grow, super easy to find. Actually, you can actually find them growing on cow patties, which was kind of gross, but those were called Liberty caps, and people were using them. There's some belief that Santa Claus is a mushroom god. All his little outfit with the white. You never heard this? It's the muscaria, Amarita muscaria, which is the red cap with the little white dots, and it's very popular in like Northern Europe, Central Europe. And these tiny little mushrooms look like the Smurf mushrooms. And if you cook them and eat them the right way, you'll get a mild psychedelic effect. So the belief was that Santa Claus is dressed that way because he's kind of like a trickster mushroom god for these folks. And all of the pagan aspect of his dress went into this mushroom thing. There's also, interestingly, Woden, I think one of the Norse gods, would ride on, and he's also a mushroom god associated with mushrooms, would ride in a sleigh pulled by deer, and he would fly through the air, and everywhere that his sleigh went, it would trickle blood onto the forest floor, and that's where the mushrooms grew. I'm telling you, this is wild stuff. Everybody was using way too many psychedelics back in the dark ages. All right. So there are over 200 species of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. The one thing you can know about them is that when you see them, they will bruise blue. if you touch them a little too hard, touch the top or you've touched the side, that's a sign of psilocybin containing mushrooms. So you have Psilocybe cubenensis, which is a well-known species, widely cultivated and used. It's the most common type. There's Liberty caps. They're found in Europe and North America. They're known very, very potent. Those are the small little guys with a big head. Psilocybe azurescens is a potent species of the Pacific Northwest. Those are bluer. That's a bluer color. And cyanesses, known as wavy caps, they're in wood chips and mulched gardens. Now, if you don't know what you're picking, do not pick any mushrooms and eat them. It's super dangerous. The difference between a true wavy cap and, I don't know, some kind of other crazy mushroom that's going to basically kill you is fairly minuscule. And if you don't know what you're doing, then it's not going to work. My dad actually took a bunch of mushrooms out of the woods years ago, and he ate some, fried them and ate them. And I think he was feeling a little bit weird. I remember this distinctly. He went to the hospital. I believe they pumped his stomach because they just didn't know what it was. Right. So he's sitting there. He's sitting there in the kitchen thinking that maybe he ate the wrong thing. They weren't psychedelics. Obviously, he wanted some kind of like a culinary mushroom. But that being said, don't do it. Just be careful if you don't know who you're talking to. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about how to create your own spores and how to create your own mushrooms. So what you do is you get a spore print, which is it looks like a fingerprint, but it's actually spore. It's a mushroom cap that's been allowed to mature, and it sends out its little spores onto a piece of paper. And sometimes they put it on a piece of aluminum foil. What you can also do is you can move those spores into a liquid medium, which is just a suspension. If you look online for mushroom spores, you'll be able to find places that can sell them to you. And they're legal to sell because they're basically for microscopy. You can use them and you can look at them under a microscope and you can learn all about mushrooms. They also have the added benefit of being able to be inoculated. You can inoculate a spawn bag. Now, a spawn bag is essentially about a 2-pound bag full of rye or another grain. Sometimes it's millet, sometimes they use manure. Most of the time it's like a rye derivative. Usually there's an injection port on the side and there's a little air pocket on the top. You buy the spore bag, you open it up, you lift up the air, you lift up the top, let the air start transferring between the outside and the inside. You basically want it airtight. The reason why you don't do this yourself, there are techniques called the Uncle Ben style, which is you use rice. The reason why you don't do this yourself is you don't know if the stuff that you're going to be using is fully pasteurized, because the rye cannot have any bacteria, can't have any other infections, because in its early weeks, these spores are very delicate. They'll die pretty quickly. So you've got this bag, you inject the spores that you've purchased for microscopy uses into the bag, into the port. Usually it's about 5 milligrams per, 5 milligrams? Yeah, I guess it would be 5 milligrams. 5 milligrams per bag. You could also do 10 per bag. It doesn't really matter. What I like to do is split it up between 2 bags, because that way at least I'm safe. The mycelium begins to colonize that bag. And you'll know it's colonizing when everything starts turning white in the bag. If you have any other color, there might be some exceptions, but vast majority of the time, if you see any other color, red, green, blue, something went wrong. Like I said, this is dirt yogurt, and you don't want weird stuff in your yogurt. So if it goes wrong, if anything happens, you basically throw that away as quickly as possible, because you don't want black mold. You don't want the weird spores that have grown in alongside the mycelium that you've grown. Once you're at a point where the entire bag is colonized, once it's essentially hard, it feels like a piece of cheese, you can start breaking it up, let it colonize again just a little bit more. Then you take a substrate. The substrate uses it's like dirt. It's pasteurized dirt that is fairly clean, as clean as dirt can be, and free of fungus and bacteria. This becomes a thinner substrate, a thinner medium for the mycelium to grow on. So you can imagine the mycelium hopping from ball to ball, if we're talking about rice and millet and rye. Whereas now it's kind of like injecting itself into this dirt. The dirt itself becomes a little mycelium uh, container. It just gets full of it. And when it's ready to fruit, you'll notice pinning, tiny little mushrooms on top of the dirt. There's also bags that include a millet at the bottom and dirt on the top. You can inject it at the bottom. You can let it propagate down there, and then you can mix the millet with the dirt, and then you create it's a one use bag. You cut the top off, and you give it some oxygen and some water, and the mushrooms start to grow. So that's an all-in-one. You can also use a tub that has air exchange, and you need to spray it occasionally. So uh, mushrooms love the woods. They love shade, and they love heat and humidity. The best time to pick mushrooms in the woods is after a summer rain. So if it rained overnight and it gets hot during the morning, then you've basically got perfect time for mushrooms to grow. The importance of this is they love this experience, and they start to grow exactly when those situation happens. So what you want to do is you want to simulate that situation as much as possible. You turn on UV lights, put it over the container that you have the mushrooms in. The UV lights start the mushrooms to pin and grow. And then you spray them with water, because mushrooms are mostly water. They need lots of water to start expanding and to start fruiting. Now, the interesting thing about mycelium is that every part of the mushroom is exactly the same. The mycelium is the same as the fruiting body, is the same as the spore. So it's a really weird plant. There's really no separation between the parts of the plant. All it is like they say it's a network, right? So the network has it takes different forms in the same way that water takes different forms, but it's all the same thing. So all you really have to do is you just have a nice big fine network through a bucket of dirt. You've poured your millet into the dirt, you mixed it around, it's spread all over, it starts to pin, and then you just give it a bunch of water and some light, 12 hours a day, basically. And then you pick them. You'll see you basically get a full box full of these guys once you're done. Now, the psilocybin mushrooms affect the brain by interacting with serotonin receptors, leading to altered perception, mood changes, and introspective experiences. You'll get visual distortions, enhanced colors. And this is if you take about 1 to 4 grams dry of mushrooms. If you eat wet mushrooms, all bets are off, because you're going to get a lot more mycelium and a lot more in there. And so it would probably be like one or two mushrooms wet, but dry you would do 1 to 4. If you're going to a party, take 1 to 1.5. If you want to sit and really like introspect, it's about 4 to 6 potentially. That's a heroic dose of 6. You'll get euphoria, deep emotional insights, a sense of interconnectedness, occasional anxiety and paranoia, which I think Dr. Green is going to talk to us about. And they're great. Denver, Oakland, Portland have decriminalized psilocybin, and Oregon has become the first state to legalize supervised use. What we're talking about now, technically illegal, still illegal in New York, but it's being done, and a lot of the legality is changing very, very quickly. So we should have a lot of legal mushrooms across the country very shortly, I think. So that was a lot. It was a nice. It was. I feel like I just gave a seminar. But was I correct, Dr. Green?
Absolutely. And two thoughts came to mind. Number one, I wonder if mushrooms influence any ideas of Super Mario creators.
Well, everybody likes that little mushroom, right? So everybody likes the amarita, the mascara. So that little red and white. The Smurfs lived in those mushrooms too. So that's an important consideration. So every time you eat a mushroom, you might be destroying a Smurf's home.
Well, the second thought was that I'm glad we're doing this, and actually I'm honored to be a part of the conversation. Since I started working with ketamine, psychedelic-like, in clinical practice, I recognize the responsibility of being a part of a positive conversation as this gets reintroduced progressively in the country. And so I'm honored to do this. The seminar was great. You actually demystified the process for me, because every time I've looked into it, I just see a lot of parts, a lot of new jargon, and I close the tab. And so it's more approachable for me
Yeah,
now.
I mean, look, so if you did the all-in-one bags, you'd be okay. You just look for all-in-one mushroom bags, and you could do these with culinary mushrooms too. The only thing you really have to worry about is just like washing your hands and getting everything clean. So when you inject, for example, you heat the needle to red hot, and you also use a little rubbing alcohol on the injection port. So you want to make sure that that needle is completely hot, red hot, and make sure there's nothing in the needle that could kind of infect the mushrooms as it's coming out. And then you stick it into the injection port and just kind of squirt it around. And everything is a self-sealing, closed environment, which is vital. That's the most important thing. Everything has to be closed because until you get to the point of fruiting, then once it's ready to go, then all bets are off. You basically have to trust the mushrooms to not to get sick. And mushrooms are fairly resilient when they're in the fruiting stage. As I said before, they can be attacked by outsiders in the growth stage, in the inoculation stage.
Awesome, awesome. It also highlights something for me that will kind of help me segue into talking about my experience with it. Is that I think it's tremendously fascinating. You know, we're describing the caution, precision needed to grow mushrooms, and it also makes me, how should I say, makes me realize just how beautiful nature is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no conscious force in nature ensuring that all the components of the growth process are perfect. So it's our replicating this process that's right in front of us. Which the reason I bring that up is because my experience with psychedelics generally, but mushrooms in particular, is that it helps me to appreciate the beauty all around me much more clearly than when I'm going about my day. And so illuminated that point.
Now, are we talking about microdosing? We didn't even talk about microdosing. What's the regimen there?
I'm the dumb one today. You're the expert today.
Well, microdosing, you could probably take a very small amount. They say it's like zero point 0.1 grams, something like that, um, every day, which would be basically like one cap or one little piece. The way I would equate it would be something like I don't know, a communion wafer or something like that. Super small. It doesn't really affect you. It doesn't really feel it. If you do that for, I'm doing the I think it's Walktel. What was it called? There's a there's a psychedelics guy. This is a pretty good book if you want to. It's A Really Good Day by Alet Waldman. Um, I've been reading this. What was the thing? We'll figure it out. I'll put it in the show notes. It's basically 1 day off, 2 days off, 1 day on, where you take the mushrooms either every other day or you wait 2 days between. So right now I'm doing a microdose regimen, which is the weekend and a Wednesday. I actually forgot yesterday. And what it does is it gives me a lot more clarity. It gives me a lot more focus. It's very, very interesting, and it's almost like such a minuscule dose you don't even feel it. Um, I found that I've been growing some fairly potent mushrooms, so I'm a little more careful about how much I eat. But yeah, as I said, you don't feel it. You can go through your day, but I'm laughing more. I'm encouraged to do this kind of stuff more, so it's giving me more energy, that kind of thing. So I'm curious to see what you've experienced.
Absolutely. So I initially experienced mushrooms as a young adult in New York City in the party scene. And it's actually interesting. One of those occasions where a friend handed it to me, and I'm an open-minded young adult, so I say sure, without knowing actually much about psychedelics. I'd never been exposed at the time. So I always look back with some humor, saying, "Thank goodness it was a lower dose,"
Hmm.
because now learning what a higher dose can do. If I had that type of experience out in the party, that would have not ended well. However, it was fun. It was fun. I definitely experienced the lower and microdose experience. Coming back, well, I was in med school at the time, so I didn't have many opportunities to really explore. So um, primarily, any casual substances were cannabis at the time. And then psychedelics came back into my radar after a trip to Colombia for ayahuasca ceremonies. And that was the first time that I recognized that psychedelics could do much more in terms of growth and opening my mind, expanding my sense of self, my appreciation of who I am in the world and who I am amongst other living things. And so I came back with that renewed insight. Then I wanted to try to replicate that. And so I purchased some mushrooms. And again, not knowing the different levels of experiences with different doses. And I'm the type of guy that tends to go hard with things. So I want to try.
I'm kind of scared to hear this, actually.
Luckily it's I keep the extremes under wraps. But I mean, long story short, with the mushrooms, I said, okay, well, this is a hero's dose. I'm taking a hero's dose. And I remember this vividly. I was about to go meet up with my brother and sister-in-law, and I was getting ready. I took the mushrooms maybe 45 minutes prior.
Okay.
And then right as I was going to leave the house, I felt the sensorium change. And so I said, let me not go out in New York City until I know where this is going to lead. Hero's dose, experience, complete ego death, actually.
Okay.
The very first time. And it was amazing. Let's just say that. Amazing in the sense that at its peak, and the way I describe psychedelics to patients now, mushrooms in particular, is that I experienced progressive lowering of filters to my experience of consciousness. And so things that I experience, visual senses, touch, the way I experience my thoughts, the way I feel my body, all operate on assumptions. You can imagine a phone or a computer doing an autocomplete to get to what you're trying to express. Our brain does that. And so the reason that I right now perceive myself in a room is because I've seen a room thousands of times. I can assume that I'm safe now because I'm sitting in a chair, I'm talking to you, I don't see a lion in front of me. But again, those operate on assumptions that what I'm experiencing sensory-wise is consistent to what I've experienced in the past. And so when those filters progressively reduce, you experience things that your brain filters out. People have a heightened sensory experience. And so at the peak psychedelic experience, you actually have no basis to understand the flood of sensory information you're experiencing. So when I first tried it, I actually had to talk myself through it through affirmations.
Mm-hmm.
However, when it started to come down from the peak, and then my sensory information began to be more and more organized, I just felt this tremendous sense of humility that I can never assume again that the reality that I'm experiencing at any given moment is exactly as I am experiencing. That's my brain telling me that this is the reality that I'm experiencing now, and I can't assume. And so naturally, as a psychiatrist, I wondered about the greater significance of this. How many of us are walking around believing that we know things? Ourselves, our place in the world, the current context, assumptions about people that we like or don't like. How many of these assumptions are actually informing our life, and what do we discover when those filters drop? And so ever since I've been methodically becoming more and more familiar with all psychedelics, mushrooms in particular. I like mushrooms because it gives you a longer experience as opposed to like ketamine. And I talk to my patients who express interest about it. A lot of patients come to me curious with ketamine, but I do sell the benefits of a longer experience. And so sorry for the long-winded answer, but that was my experience with mushrooms. And ever since, I've become very familiar, very, very.
Tell us about the concept of the ego death. I don't feel I've ever felt it. Maybe my ego is too large and in charge, but it feels like something that people are looking for.
Yeah, and I would just say, just to kind of raise a point from things that you mentioned earlier, what we're discussing is fascinating. A lot of people come to the office intrigued, but I also caution that at first goal is to become familiar with your experience at different dose levels. Do not, with any prior experience of a psychedelic, think that a hero's dose can be tolerated, even if you're a big drinker. No, start small and work your way up. The reason I say that is because my first ego death experience was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. However, I was able to talk myself through it in the sense that, again, when I no longer understand my sensory experience, I think I likened it in a previous episode to potentially what it's like to be born and have all of your senses turn on to the world at once. It triggers a fight or flight response because you're grasping for meaning that you don't have. And that's the easiest way I can describe it. Nothing makes sense to you. And so, what also doesn't make sense to you is you no longer trust that you are you.
Mm.
You may wonder if this represents what an overdose feels like in front of your face. Even the flow of thoughts that come to mind are not your characteristic thoughts. And so anyway, you're questioning aspects not only of your reality, but yourself. And my ego, who I think I am in this world, gets challenged. And at that time, I pretty much was resigned to laying on the floor and telling myself, well, I can still think, and my voice sounds familiar to me, so I'm going to ground myself by talking to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, be still, be still. It feels uncomfortable because it's unfamiliar, but nothing's actually progressing to get worse from this peak point. And so I grounded myself in those affirmations until it reached the peak and it started to come downward. And then again, like I said, I was so profoundly affected by that experience. It piqued my interest to explore more.
Now here's the trick. I get to be the smart guy this episode because so what you did a few things wrong. Yes. So first off, you took a heroic dose. Then you said you're going to go meet your brother and sister-in-law in the city. Everybody says, okay, we're going to take a bunch of mushrooms, go to the club or whatever. You start doing that, you're going to see you're going to see people's faces melt off. The one thing that I've experienced, and as you say, the sensorium kind of like is changed completely. One thing that when we look at each other's faces, we see the blood going into each other's face, like blood pumping. But we also especially if you're pale, you also have the situation where occasionally the face is completely gray because the blood isn't pumping. Our brains cut that out. So if you're looking at yourself and you look at yourself and you accidentally see it between pumps, and you can see it between pumps, you see a corpse essentially. So that's the scary thing. So don't look at yourself. One of the things that I recommend, and this is what I do whenever I go on my I have an evening thing that I do with a bunch of people. A really nice guy takes care of it for us. He plays music, and the trick is lay down on a comfortable surface in a sleeping bag, whatever. Put eye shades on. Close your eyes. Don't look at anything. Don't go to the bathroom. Don't stare yourself in the mirror. Don't go to the Louvre. And just lay there and just let the experience wash over you. What you get is internal visions as opposed to external visions, and internal visions are much easier to handle when you're, instead of looking at yourself looking like a corpse, you see mandalas. Once I saw an entire chapter of my novel acted out for me by the characters, which was wild. And I wrote it down later and I actually used it in my novel. It was amazing. You could talk to people that are long dead, all this other good stuff. But that requires you to just keep your eyes closed and just sit there and think. Now, the other trick is you can't overdose on mushrooms. You can be uncomfortable. You can maybe get a tummy ache, but you really can't overdose because these things are essentially they're mushrooms, right? So you're not going to like a fatal dose of psilocybin is like, I don't know, 1,000 pounds or something nuts. And it's almost impossible. That doesn't mean somebody can't try, but it's not going to end well for anybody. So yeah, so your fear was there, but it was ungrounded, and it's something that you probably should have thought through before you took the heroic dose. Set and setting, right? And you know all about this. Creating that right set and setting. A set and setting is not brunch on a Sunday morning in Midtown. It's a quiet room with no candles because you don't want to knock those things over, but maybe like a low lighting and some techno music, and just let yourself go.
As I learned afterwards, and I can't underscore enough what beauty you can discover when your personal filters are lowered just enough. I feel it, but also describe it and use it to reconnect people with their bodies. You feel yourself differently. You can develop an awareness of what range of sensations that you don't typically have access to when locked into your routine. I've had patients who experience chronic pain tell me that when they do mushrooms, they start stretching and are fascinated at their ability to feel themselves outside of what they know as somebody with pain, somebody who has to contract some measure of their mobility to work around chronic pain. They feel a liberating sense of freeness. Um, I've connected to my own personal introspection about meanings of life and death. I've also connected to dead relatives, ancestors. I've been able to contextualize my place in the scope of all of human history. Like, it's just fascinating. And again, this came from my being curious about this stuff prior to, so I was predisposed to that type of introspection. When I work with people who are new to psychedelics, I'm helping to kind of shape a frame that they can use, shape that mindset so that they can draw upon that and experience to unlock these levels of insight.
What about depression? What would you recommend for depression? You do ketamine, obviously, and ketamine has had more research associated with it. But do you recommend psychedelics for depression, or psilocybin for depression?
I recommend it as a tool. So I work with the patients to really understand what tools they need. If I'm getting a sense that somebody may benefit from a psychedelic, I readily recommend it. And then, we talk about which ones may be right for you. So, like, if you are somebody who doesn't have a lot of time, can't really allot the time for a multiple hour experience, that may lend itself to trying ketamine initially. However, I do explain to people the differences in time that someone would spend in the journey. And if they have the time, I recommend that they don't stop at ketamine, that they do try psilocybin. They do try some of these longer acting ones, because I think there's a lot to be gained from spending multiple hours in this space. I certainly prefer it as well.
Well, I equate it to like a meditation where you're not falling asleep, your legs don't hurt. You can immediately go to that place where you can focus on things. And I think that's the important thing. When's the next time you're going to sit still for 6 hours without like gutting on your phone or like watching TV or whatever? So that's the benefit, really.
Absolutely. And I also frame it in terms of giving you the opportunity to rediscover yourself by, again, experiencing consciousness without the rigidity of these filters that we operate with. And so for somebody that's depressed, it can be a good way to really see that, they are locked into a particular perspective about themselves, about their circumstance. And, their reasoning and logic become circular at that point where it almost makes so much sense that it's hard to get out of that mentality. And so the psychedelic can pierce the rigidity of that depressive view of the world to show them that there's another way. There's hundreds of other ways to view their own experience themselves. And that's often the motivation to unlock whatever the issue is in depression. But it can apply to other conditions. Like currently, we have to operate in a regulatory climate. And so, ketamine is often marketed based in a limited way, based on the data that we know. It was studied in a depression population. And so you'll hear clinicians say, and sometimes believe, that it's only good for depression. And so I tell patients the full benefits that are possible. And like we've said before, I think everybody can benefit. And I tell people this.
All right. So you heard it here first. Go take some mushrooms, but
Yep.
don't go out to brunch with your brother and sister-in-law.
And even if you're a big jack guy that can pound 20 beers, don't start off with the heroes dose. Trust me.
In fact, you should probably slow down with the beers a couple of days before you take the mushrooms. Also,
Indeed.
don't do it on a full stomach, by the way, because if your tummy starts to hurt, and you start doing all kinds of fun stuff, on mushrooms, it's not a pretty experience. Let's just say. A lot of the places that I go to, they have a special room where if you start to feel it a little too much, they'll put you in another room. Another thing that we do at our thing is you don't talk to anybody else. You don't wake somebody else up next to you and say, "Oh, I just saw the face of God," because I mean they got their own face of God to look at. So that's the interesting thing. That's why you don't want to go to a rave doing this stuff. You can, I guess. Music sounds great with it, but do a lower dose, 1 gram maybe. And if you still don't feel anything about it after a couple hours, because the metabolites change for different people. If you don't still feel nothing after a couple hours, and maybe you can take a little bit more. But yeah, I think that's the gist of it, long and short of it. Next week, let's do some LSD, shall we?
Yes.
So this has been Personal Nirvana. I think this is a really nice format for the show. I feel like this is going to be helpful for folks. So I'm John Biggs.
And I'm Marcel Green, psychiatrist.
And we will see you next episode. Look forward to doing some LSD with Dr. Green.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Personal Nirvana. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. That helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Once again, thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Personal Nirvana.